In a previous episode, I took the bike off-road to put it through its paces and see what it was capable of, but unfortunately blew the oil seals in the fork, squirting oil all the way up the fork tubes. So in this episode, I'm going to give the stanchions a good service because that service is long overdue. In order to remove the stanchions, I've first got to start removing all the parts that are attached to it, starting off with the mudguard. The screw holding the mudguard in place is a Torx screw, and it's actually quite stiff to remove, bearing in mind that it wasn't that long ago that I fitted it, so I'm going to be sticking some copper grease on it when I put it back into place. Next up are the two caliper bolts holding the calipers in place. I replaced these when I carried out the caliper service. They are still looking shiny, so they've done the job, and again I'm just going to take these out and do exactly the same on the other side. At this point I start to remove the axle bolt. This catches me a little bit off guard, as you notice there. Whee, off he goes. And embarrassment aside, I go at it again, a bit more stable in position this time. I slip off again, but it does come undone. Whoever tightened that up last was a very strong person. It was me. At this point I move the axle bolt as far out as I can without it falling off its thread, and then I start to undo the pinch bolts at the bottom of the stanchions, ready to remove the axle bolt. And with the axle knocked through, I use my super mal strength and pull that axle out, noting that it is nice and greasy. Nice and greasy.
Removing the ABS sensor is where I finally get caught out. I take out the two screws, but the thing will not budge no matter how much I try and twist it out. So that's something I deal with again a bit later on. The last thing I do is remove the wheel, and I could have made this easier by pulling the calipers actually off the disc, but that's a lesson learned for another day. I was just in a rush to pull the wheel off. So here we go, this is the moment I realise the calipers are still on. Well done me, now the wheel should come out.
So this is going to be a little bit tricky for me now because I need to get the bike up high enough to be able to remove the stanchions from the bridges. Obviously I've not disconnected the top part yet. One of the other things I've noticed is the little sensor for the ABS is stuck in place, so I need to whack that out. I need to do a bit more things, and obviously it's nice to see what this actual area looks like because I didn't actually pay any attention to it while I first started. I just wanted to get out on the bike once I had done the sort of basic service. And again, another thing I've got going on in the background is I'm looking into the hall sensor. So part of this video will be used in the hall sensor side of things, and obviously the bits relating to the suspension will be put in this video. But yeah, it's not really in a bad place, but there's a couple of things I've noticed I need to sort of grease up properly, put them back together, and then next year this bike can be completely stripped down, powder coated, and will look really nice once I've finished with it. So yeah, we're getting there. Let's start pulling the stanchions off.
Using a 14mm socket and a 22mm spanner that I bought brand new just for this, I get to work removing the nut from the top of the fork tube. With it completely loosened off, I use my fingers to take it off the rest of the way before moving on to the other side of the bike and carrying out the same actions. With the two top nuts removed, the fork tubes drop slightly, and if I was to remove the bleed screws at the top of the fork tubes, I could remove them and leave the stanchion in place to service the suspension. But in this instance I need to complete other jobs, so I'm going to take the screws out of the suspension bridge and remove the stanchions. To make life a bit easier, I employ my finest large flat blade screwdriver to separate the gap in the fork bridge and then work on sliding the stanchion down. But to my surprise, that ABS sensor that I didn't remove earlier on has now come back to bite me, so I get my finest set of vice grips, clamp those bad boys on, and then give it a nice twist, and look out, we got freedom. Now that the ABS sensor has been removed, I move back up to putting the screwdriver in between the gap on the fork bridge and working on pulling the stanchion down for the rest of the way. It does get a bit stuck on the dust seal, so I now have to work on getting the dust seal out before I can pull the stanchion completely down and then remove the fork tube from the stanchion. With the dust seal and fork tube rubber top removed, I repeat the process on the left stanchion and begin removing the bleed screw from the fork tube. This allows air into the system so that the fork tube can be pushed inside the stanchion and then removed from the fork bridge.
So that's the two stanchions removed from the bike. It was an easier process than I thought, but I did leave the ABS sensor on last week so that when I returned this week, I completely forgot that I'd left it in place. I just thought I had to undo the screws, pull the stanchions out. But we live and learn. That is now off. The stanchions are off. It's time to take out the internals, re-oil, reseal, and then refit.
Because I removed the bleed screw earlier on in the video, it's now easy for me to pull the fork tube out of the stanchion, just giving it a little bit of twist every now and then when it sticks. I've put a load of stuff on the floor as well to make sure that when it drips on the floor, it's going to be caught, because that stuff is absolutely disgusting.
That stinks.
And as you can see, the condition of the oil seal matches the condition of the oil, so this is definitely a worthwhile change. So let's carry on and use yet another new tool to pull out the seal from the stanchion. The last thing I'm going to remove is this rusty little washer. I'm going to clean it up before replacing it. I'll then move on to cleaning where the seal and the washer were housed, before feeding the trusty blue roll down into the stanchion itself and then pushing it a bit further with this nifty little tool I found in the garage. It's like a handle or something. And if you look at the outcome, it was well worth doing, because that looks like a bad night after a curry. So it's time to start replacing everything, and here are the two brand new oil seals. I get to work lubricating them. I fit the washers that I've given a bit of a clean up, and then start to press the seal into the top of the stanchion. Happy that it's seated nice and flush with the stanchion, I use a large socket to sit on the outside of the seal before whacking it with a big rubber mallet, just to get it seated in its final location. After watching back this footage, it feels a bit overkill to have whacked it as many times as I did there, so watching these next few whacks feels like massive overkill. When it came to replacing the oil, I put 0.47 of a litre in each fork and then refitted the fork tube. I then let it settle at its own weight just to make sure I wasn't going to squirt any oil anywhere. Then I took a measurement to make sure it was no longer than 25 centimeters, so I had the gap underneath the handlebars. Got the new washers for the bleed screws, fitted the bleed screws, and then tightened them up hand tight to make sure there was no air coming out and they weren't over tightened. The last thing to go back into the stanchions was the retaining clips, and I placed them in nice and gently. They were coated in a nice grease and they fitted well into the recess, so the seal was seated nice and properly. Fitting is obviously the reversal of the removal. I've got to get the stanchion up underneath the bridge, then I add a new dust seal on top, then I use my favourite screwdriver to separate the bridge enough so that I can raise the stanchion up into its resting place. I then fit the new rubber protector to the top of the fork tube, and then fit it underneath the handlebar and tighten up the nut. The last thing I do is refit the dust cover before moving on and refitting the second fork leg, and as far as jobs go, this hasn't been a bad one. I just look forward to moving on and checking out the electrical issues that the bike currently has.
That's where I'm going to leave the video today, and that's because I need access to the front end of the bike to check the belt and possibly the Hall effect sensor, because the bike is becoming a right nightmare to start. But that's another story altogether and another video for another day. But if you've enjoyed this video, please press the like button down below and consider subscribing if you're not already a subscriber. Thank you very much for watching. I will bring you another episode soon.